January 1940. Europe was on fire. Cities that had stood for centuries now lay in ruins. The Wehrmacht marched across borders like a machine that knew no pause, and the Luftwaffe ruled the skies with a chilling confidence. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched uneasily, a giant still half asleep, its industries busy building cars, not bombers, refrigerators, not rifles. But in the heart of Washington, one man had already seen what was coming. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, calm, methodical, with a cigarette holder tilted upward like a spear of determination, understood that America could not afford to sleep through another world war. When he looked at the reports from Europe, at the photographs of Polish cities burning under German air raids, he didn't just see tragedy, he saw a warning. The future would belong not to the nation with the largest army, but to the one that could build the fastest. And so, on May 16, 1940, Roosevelt stood before Congress and made a declaration that would change history. "I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year." The room fell silent. Some senators looked up, unsure if they had heard correctly. 50,000? The entire country had built barely 4,000 aircraft the previous year, most of them small, outdated, and unsuitable for modern war. The number sounded like madness. But to Roosevelt, it was not madness. It was destiny. Half a world away, in Berlin, news of the president's statement reached the office of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, Hitler's flamboyant, overconfident commander of the Luftwaffe. Dressed in his white uniform heavy with medals, Göring read the American announcement, smirked, and burst into laughter. 50,000 planes a year, he scoffed. They can't even build 50,000 bicycles without falling apart. His aides laughed with him. To them, America was a land of jazz, movies, and assembly lines, not of war. The idea that these carefree factory workers could outbuild the disciplined might of Germany was absurd. But Göring was wrong. Dead wrong. Because in the factories of Detroit, in the foundries of Pittsburgh, and in the shipyards of California, a new kind of war machine was waking up, one built not on ideology, but on sheer industrial willpower. At the center of that awakening stood a man named William Knudsen. Knudsen was no general. He had never led troops or flown a plane, but he knew machines, and more importantly, he knew how to build them at scale. As the former president of General Motors, Knudsen had mastered the art of mass production. When Roosevelt asked him to help prepare the nation for war, Knudsen didn't hesitate. He resigned from one of the most powerful corporate positions in America and joined the government for $1 a year. His mission: turn America's peacetime industries into the arsenal of democracy. Knudsen traveled across the country like a man possessed, visiting factories, meeting industrialists, studying blueprints. He went to Henry Ford's empire in Dearborn, to Boeing's assembly lines in Seattle, to Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica. Everywhere he went, he delivered the same message: we must prepare now. We must build, even before the war reaches our shores. At first, many resisted. Why risk billions on war contracts when the United States wasn't even fighting? But as Knudsen spoke, his conviction spread like wildfire. We can outproduce anyone, he told them. We just need to start. And start they did. In the summer of 1940, car factories began experimenting with aircraft parts. Engineers accustomed to stamping fenders learned to shape aluminum for wings. Mechanics who once assembled engines for Bix were retrained to fit radial engines for fighters. America's greatest industrialists, Ford, General Motors, Douglas, Lockheed, North American Aviation, began working together, something unthinkable in peacetime competition. Slowly, the gears of a sleeping giant began to turn. But in Berlin, Göring still mocked. The Americans are amateurs, he told Hitler. They think they can build warplanes the way they build toasters. He didn't understand that that was exactly the point. America's strength lay in its assembly lines, in the rhythm of automation, in the precision of repetition, in the relentless drive of innovation. The same system that had flooded the world with Model Ts and Coca-Cola was now about to flood the skies with BE-17 Flying Fortresses and PE-51 Mustangs. By 1941, something extraordinary was happening. Entire industries were transforming before the world's eyes. Civilian car production came to a halt. Conveyor belts that once carried sedans now moved fuselages. Factories that had never built a plane before were suddenly delivering hundreds a month. When Roosevelt gave his famous speech calling the United States the arsenal of democracy, it wasn't a metaphor. It was a statement of fact. In the city of Willow Run, Michigan, Henry Ford decided to take on the challenge of mass-producing bombers, not just building them, but doing it with the same efficiency as his automobile empire. The aircraft in question was the B-24 Liberator, a complex, heavy bomber with over 488,000 individual parts. No one had ever attempted to produce such a machine on an assembly line. Ford's engineers were skeptical. The bomber's wingspan alone was too large for their existing facilities. But Ford had never been a man who accepted limits. If we can build cars by the hundreds of thousands, he said, we can build bombers by the thousands. And so began one of the greatest industrial experiments in human history. At Willow Run, construction crews broke ground on what would become the largest factory under one roof in the world. 3.5 million square feet of roaring ambition. The plant was so massive that it had its own fire department, cafeteria, and internal rail system. Its goal? Produce one bomber per hour. At first, chaos reigned. The early models coming off the line were riddled with defects. Bolts were misplaced, wiring was inconsistent, and assembly errors grounded aircraft before they could fly. The press mocked Ford's efforts. Willow Run, one columnist wrote, more like Will It Run. But failure only fueled innovation. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production genius, reorganized the line into modular subassemblies. Instead of building an entire plane in one go, teams focused on individual sections, wings, fuselage, tail, engines, each perfected separately and then joined together in a final, seamless flow. Workers learned fast. Many were women who had never held a wrench before the war. They came from farms, cities, and small towns, mothers, wives, and daughters determined to do their part. Their precision and discipline stunned visiting generals. They became the living embodiment of the slogan, "We can do it." And they did. By mid-1943, Willow Run was rolling out a fully assembled B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. The impossible had become routine. At the same time, other factories across the nation were rising to the challenge. In Seattle, Boeing's B-17 production exploded. In California, Douglas and Lockheed built the versatile C-47 transports and the sleek P-38 Lightning fighters. North American Aviation's P-51 Mustang, originally developed in just 117 days, would soon dominate the skies over Europe. Everywhere, the sound of machinery filled the air, the heartbeat of a nation forging freedom from metal and fire. And all the while, German intelligence struggled to make sense of it. Early reports from spies in the United States described massive factories and 24-hour production cycles. But Göring dismissed them. Exaggerations, he said. American propaganda. He was still laughing, but the laughter would not last, because soon, those factories would send their creations across the Atlantic, and the skies above Europe would never look the same again. By early 1942, the laughter in Berlin had turned into confusion. Hermann Göring's intelligence officers brought him new reports almost daily, satellite plants springing up across the American Midwest, railways filled with aircraft parts, shipments of aluminum measured not in tons but in mountains. Every report told the same story. The Americans were doing something impossible. Yet Göring refused to believe. It is a trick, he insisted, waving the papers away. They will never sustain it. But the trick, if there was one, lay in the invisible rhythm of American industry. Day and night, the assembly lines thundered. In California's San Fernando Valley, the Douglas Aircraft Company expanded so fast that workers called it Little City. A worker could enter one gate with raw aluminum and, by the time they reached the far end of the plant, stand beneath a complete airplane. The Boeing plant in Seattle was so enormous that engineers designed it with camouflage roofs to fool enemy reconnaissance. From above, it looked like a quiet suburb, complete with fake streets and painted lawns. Inside, the roar was deafening. Sparks rained from welding torches as men and women leaned over the skeletons of future bombers. Between shifts, they drank coffee so strong it could dissolve a spoon. Many slept in nearby boarding houses, some in their cars, because they didn't want to lose a single hour of work. By the spring of that year, the United States had produced over 20,000 aircraft, 5 times the number of planes built the previous year. And it was just the beginning. Across the Atlantic, the skies over Britain were thick with smoke. The Royal Air Force had fought Germany to a standstill during the Battle of Britain, but at a terrible cost. Every pilot lost, every bomber shot down, was a wound that would take months to heal. When the first shipments of American-built aircraft arrived, gleaming PA-40 Warhawks, Douglas Boston bombers, and cargo planes that could cross oceans, British mechanics ran their hands along the fuselages as if touching salvation. Each aircraft carried more than metal. It carried the promise of momentum. Roosevelt's dream was working. America was not only building for itself, but for every nation still standing against fascism. At home, something remarkable was happening to the American spirit. Families began collecting scrap aluminum from pots and pans, donating it to aircraft plants. Children gathered old newspapers and rubber tires for recycling drives. Factories that had once been fierce competitors now shared blueprints and tooling methods. It was capitalism transformed by necessity, an economy united by one purpose. And that purpose was now unstoppable. In Buffalo, New York, Bell Aircraft developed the P-39 Airacobra, a strange machine with its engine mounted behind the pilot and a cannon firing through the propeller hub. It was fast, unconventional, and deadly at low altitude. In Long Beach, California, the Consolidated Aircraft Corporation experimented with massive seaplanes for Pacific patrols. In Fort Worth, Texas, workers labored around the clock building B-24s under license. The rhythm of production became a national pulse. Newspaper headlines bragged about record-breaking output. War bonds were sold with the promise that every dollar turned into bullets and wings. Even Hollywood joined the effort. Movie stars visited factories to boost morale, radio shows broadcast from plant floors, and patriotic songs celebrated the workers who built the engines of freedom. Yet the human cost was real. In Willow Run, exhaustion was a constant companion. 12-hour shifts blurred into each other. The clatter of hammers followed workers home in their dreams. Injuries were common. Still, few complained. As one woman said to a reporter, wiping sweat from her brow, "My brother's in the Pacific. I can stand a few blisters." By the end of 1942, the United States had produced nearly 50,000 aircraft, reaching Roosevelt's impossible goal in less than 3 years. But production did not stop there. It accelerated. Henry Kaiser, a shipbuilder known for his relentless pace, turned his eyes to aircraft. He joined forces with industrialist Howard Hughes to build a flying boat so large it could carry 750 soldiers across the Atlantic. The project, the H for Hercules, later nicknamed the Spruce Goose, was a failure in practice, but it symbolized the scale of American ambition. Nothing, it seemed, was too big to attempt. Meanwhile, in Germany, factories were falling behind. Allied bombing raids targeted fuel depots, aluminum plants, and rail lines. Each loss tightened the noose around the Luftwaffe. Engineers scrambled to compensate by simplifying designs, producing cheap fighters like the Focke-Wulf 190A8, but even simplicity could not overcome scarcity. In contrast, America was now producing bombers faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. One general remarked, "Our problem is no longer production, it's parking space." By 1943, the flood had become a tidal wave. The U.S. Army Air Forces deployed new models that stunned the enemy: the B-17 Flying Fortress with its bristling machine guns, the B-24 Liberator with its enormous range, and the P-47 Thunderbolt, a rugged fighter that could dive at nearly 500 miles an hour. Each aircraft was a mechanical promise: the sky belongs to us now. In Europe, German pilots began noticing something eerie. No matter how many bombers they shot down, the next day's formation seemed just as large. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a spoon, recalled Luftwaffe ace Gunther Rohr. The psychological weight was crushing. At the same time, American innovation was rewriting the rules of logistics. The Liberty ship program had already proven that ships could be built in weeks instead of months. Now, the same philosophy was applied to aircraft transport. New routes were opened across Greenland and Iceland, turning the North Atlantic into an aerial highway. Frozen airfields sprang up in Newfoundland and Labrador, each one a stepping stone for squadrons of freshly built aircraft heading to Europe. It was a choreography of global proportions. Back in Detroit, Knudsen and his colleagues tracked it all on massive maps. Colored pins marked factories, shipping lanes, and delivery schedules. Lines crisscrossed the continent like arteries feeding a living giant. Every day, thousands of new workers joined the effort: machinists, welders, engineers, and clerks, all bound together by Roosevelt's promise. When reporters asked Knudsen if he had ever doubted the goal, he smiled faint. "Doubt," he said. "Doubt is what the other side has." He was right. By mid-1943, Germany's air war was collapsing. Its fuel shortages grew critical. Its pilot training program decimated. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was fighting a losing battle against time itself. In the skies over the Ruhr Valley, American bombers came in waves, hundreds at a time, each escorted by long-range fighters that swept the heavens clean. Factories that had taken years to build were reduced to smoking ruins in a single afternoon. Still, Göring refused to face the truth. He berated his generals, accused them of cowardice, and demanded miracle weapons. Jet fighters, rockets, new bombs, anything that could turn the tide. But miracles could not be mass-produced. In America, they didn't need miracles. They had systems. The production network was now so vast that individual plants specialized in components. One built only engines, another only propellers, another only navigation systems. Each piece fit into the larger mosaic, flowing through railroads and convoys like blood through veins. The entire continent had become a single, coordinated machine, and its hum was deafening. By the summer of 1943, the hum of that industrial machine could be heard even in the silence of the American countryside. Farmers near Willow Run would look up from their fields to see the sky streaked with silver, test flights of newly assembled bombers banking toward the horizon. Children waved as the aircraft thundered overhead, each one a mechanical promise that the war would someday end. But inside the factories, the race was not against Germany anymore. It was against time. Every hour mattered. Every delay could mean another convoy lost, another city burned, another pilot who never came home. At Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach, a production manager named Helen Martin walked the line each morning, stopwatch in hand. Her workers were mostly women, many of whom had never touched a power tool before the war. Some had left behind families, others had never worked outside the home. They wore denim overalls, tied scarves over their hair, and learned quickly. Helen would later recall, "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes. We just wanted to make sure our boys had what they needed." These women became the backbone of America's air power. Rosie the Riveter was not just a slogan, it was an entire generation. In just 3 years, women went from 1% to over 60% of the aircraft workforce. They built bombers, inspected engines, wired instruments, and ran lathes with precision that astonished even seasoned engineers. At Boeing, women designed their own tools when none existed. At North American Aviation, they trained newcomers by the thousands, ensuring every plane left the line on schedule. The efficiency gains were staggering, not because of automation, but because of human determination. When the first all-female shift at Willow Run completed a B-24 bomber without a single rejected rivet, the factory erupted in cheers. A foreman wrote home to his son in the Pacific, "You boys fight the war, and we'll keep the sky full." By late 1943, the results spoke for themselves. American production had surpassed every target. Over 85,000 aircraft rolled out that year, more than Germany and Japan combined. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a slogan. It was a reality so vast that it defied imagination. Factories no longer counted planes by the day, they counted them by the hour. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Göring's rage grew volcanic. Reports of losses poured in daily, fuel depots destroyed, assembly lines bombed, pilots killed faster than they could be replaced. His own Luftwaffe generals warned him the skies were lost. Yet he ranted about cowardice and defeatism. The truth was written in the smoke above Germany. During Big Week in February 1944, the US 8th and 15th Air Forces launched over 3,500 bomber sorties against German aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe fought bravely but hopelessly. They lost hundreds of planes, and, more crucially, irreplaceable veteran pilots. General Adolf Gulland, one of Germany's top aces, confessed afterward, "We could not fight mathematics. For every fighter we lost, they built 5. The mathematics were merciless." American factories were now producing nearly 100,000 aircraft a year. Bombers, fighters, transports, trainers, each a gear in the colossal machine of war. Germany was producing a fraction of that number, and even those were increasingly made in underground tunnels by slave laborers who sabotaged them whenever they could. The contrast was absolute: freedom versus fear, innovation versus desperation. Back in Michigan, at Willow Run, Ford engineers had finally solved the production bottlenecks that once crippled the plant. They implemented new conveyor systems, automated riveting arms, and modular sub-assemblies that could be swapped in minutes. Workers no longer built an entire plane at once, they built the parts that made building planes faster. In April 1944, they achieved the impossible: one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. One bomber every 63 minutes. That single factory was now producing more aircraft than all of Germany combined. When American bombers filled the skies over Berlin, it was not just an assault, it was a declaration. Each formation was a message written in smoke: "You laughed at our production. Now, it buries you." Luftwaffe pilots like Johannes Steinhoff recalled the horror of watching endless waves of bombers stretching from horizon to horizon. "There was no beginning and no end," he said. "Only sky full of enemies." Germany's advanced fighters, the Focke-Wulfs, the Messerschmitts, were deadly in the hands of skilled pilots, but those pilots were vanishing. Fuel shortages forced trainees to practice in gliders. Some squadrons received new aircraft without engines, waiting weeks for parts that never came. While Göring clung to fantasies of wonder weapons, America was already building the next generation. Jet prototypes like the Bell P-59 Aerocomet and the Lockheed P-080 Shooting Star hinted at a future Germany could no longer reach. Even Roosevelt's death in April 1945 could not slow the machine. The system he set in motion now moved on its own, driven by millions of hands and one unshakable idea: that democracy, when mobilized, could outbuild any empire. The air war over Europe was now over in all but name. Germany's cities lay in ruins, its skies empty. Göring, once the proud commander of the world's most powerful air force, now hid in bunkers, listening to the distant thunder of American bombers he could no longer stop. He had laughed in 1940 when Roosevelt promised 50,000 planes a year. By 1945, that laughter echoed back to him from every ruined factory and burning city. In the final weeks of the war, As American troops pushed across the Rhine, Göring surrendered to elements of the U.S. 36th Infantry Division. The once mighty Reichsmarschall was now a prisoner, tired, overweight, his medals stripped away, his uniform stained with sweat. When interrogated, he tried to sound defiant. Our technology was superior, he insisted. Only numbers defeated us. But as American officers showed him photos of Willow Run, of Boeing, of Douglas, his bravado faded. That single factory, he whispered, it produced more planes than my entire Air Force. For the first time, Göring understood the true scale of what America had done. It wasn't merely production, it was transformation. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the world began to take stock of what had happened and of what had made it possible. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, existed now only in fragments. Its pilots were either dead, captured, or grounded by lack of fuel. The Allies, on the other hand, had flooded the skies with machines so numerous that air superiority became not a contest, but a condition of war itself. The final tally was staggering. In just 4 years, American industry had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 of them in a single year. Factories that once built cars, refrigerators, or sewing machines had turned into centers of mass aviation. Cities like Seattle, Wichita, and Fort Worth had grown into industrial metropolises overnight. The sky itself seemed to bend under the weight of American ambition. And yet, what made this transformation even more extraordinary wasn't the machinery, it was the people behind it. The story of the arsenal of democracy was not just a story of steel and oil, but of sweat, heart, and sheer willpower. Take the story of Charles "Charlie" Moore, a young draftsman at the Curtiss-Wright plant in Buffalo. Before the war, he was an artist, sketching landscapes and portraits. When the war began, he found himself designing wing assemblies. He'd spend nights sketching how rivets might fit tighter, or how to shave seconds off the time it took to attach an engine cowling. One day, his design tweak saved 12 minutes per aircraft, multiplied across 10,000 planes. It was like gaining an entire factory. He never saw combat, but his pencil strokes changed the course of it. Then there were the black workers who joined the industrial front despite segregation and prejudice. The Tuskegee Airmen, the first African-American fighter pilots, relied on aircraft built by men and women who were often denied equal rights in their own country. At the North American Aviation plant in Los Angeles, hundreds of black welders, riveters, and assemblers worked in segregated lines but shared a single mission. One of them, Henry Thomas, wrote in his diary, "When I see those planes take off, I know I'm part of something that even hate can't stop." That was the soul of the American war effort, a machine powered not by uniformity, but by unity. As the war in Europe ended, the focus shifted to the Pacific. Japan still fought fiercely across islands and seas, and the demand for aircraft intensified even further. The B-29 Superfortress, a marvel of engineering, became the symbol of America's next phase. Designed for long-range bombing, capable of carrying immense payloads, it was a flying fortress like no other. Its development had been fraught with setbacks, engine fires, design flaws, delays, but by 1944, the B-29 was ready. Boeing's factories ran around the clock, with thousands of engineers perfecting its pressurized cabins and remote-controlled gun turrets. Each one cost more than a tank, but America could afford it, not because of wealth, but because of will. These bombers would later carry the atomic bombs that ended the war, built in part by the same hands that had riveted the first B-17s. From the drafting tables of Seattle to the skies over Hiroshima, the line was direct and undeniable. But the miracle of production did not vanish with the peace. It reshaped the world that followed. The techniques born in wartime factories laid the foundation for modern aviation, jet travel, and the global economy. The same engineers who once counted rivets began counting stars, moving into the aerospace age. By the 1950s, many of those wartime workers found themselves building the first rockets that would one day reach the. When historians tried to quantify how the Allies had won the war, the answer was often reduced to simple numbers: 100,000 planes, 10 million soldiers, for years. But behind those numbers lay something far less tangible, a belief that when free people are pushed to their limits, they can achieve the impossible. Even in Germany, after the war, that belief resonated. Many captured Luftwaffe officers admitted, with a kind of grim respect, that they had underestimated the Americans completely. They saw them as consumers, not builders; as soldiers, not inventors. Göring himself, during the Nuremberg trials, reportedly told an American officer, "You overwhelmed us not with tanks or guns, but with factories." It was an admission born of defeat, but also of truth. For all the bombs dropped and all the battles fought, the real victory was forged long before the front lines. It was forged in Detroit, in Kansas City, in Seattle, in every place where a factory worker looked at a blueprint and saw not metal, but hope. Hope that the next plane might bring a brother home. Hope that the next engine might shorten the war. Hope that ordinary effort could change the course of history. In 1940, Goring had laughed. By 1945, America had built more than 300,000 aircraft, 6 times what Roosevelt had promised, and far beyond what any nation had ever imagined. Factories once filled with noise fell silent again, but their legacy roared on in every sky the world over. In the decades to come, the American aircraft industry would dominate the planet, from commercial aviation to space exploration, all born from that moment of disbelief, when arrogance met ambition, and laughter turned into surrender. And so, when historians trace the story of the 20th century, the rise of air power, the dawn of the jet age, the reach for the stars, they find its heartbeat in those frantic war years, when a nation of mechanics, mothers, dreamers, and engineers decided to outbuild tyranny itself. Hermann Göring never truly understood what he was up against. He thought he was facing an army. In reality, he was facing an idea, and ideas, once ignited, cannot be bombed, silenced, or stopped. After the war ended, the ruins of Europe told a silent story, not just of destruction, but of transformation. Bombed-out German cities stood like skeletons of empire, while across the Atlantic, American factories transitioned almost overnight from weapons of war to engines of peace. The same plants that once churned out bombers and fighters now built tractors, automobiles, and passenger planes. But the people who had worked those lines, who had breathed the rhythm of production for years, couldn't simply turn it off. For many, it wasn't just a job, it was a mission that had shaped their identity. The whistle of the factory bell had become their battle cry. At Boeing's Seattle plant, workers began converting B-17 assembly lines into civilian airliner production. The result was the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, one of the first luxury passenger planes of the post-war era. At Douglas, engineers retooled the legendary DC series, transforming wartime transport planes into commercial jets. The sky that had been the battlefield of freedom was now opening to commerce, tourism, and global connection. The industrial miracle that Göring had laughed at didn't just win the war, it built the modern world. By 1947, America's aviation industry employed nearly 500,000 people. Many of the same women who had riveted bombers were now flight engineers, draftsmen, or technicians. Rosie the Riveter didn't disappear, she evolved. She became an engineer, a scientist, a pilot, and for every innovation, there was a ghost of war behind it. Jet propulsion, radar, pressurized cabins, all born out of conflict, now harnessed for peace. Even in Germany, as the Marshall Plan rebuilt the ruins, there was a grudging recognition that the war had forced humanity to accelerate its technological evolution by decades. Captured German scientists marveled at the scale and efficiency of American production. One Luftwaffe engineer, when shown a U.S. aircraft assembly line after the war, simply shook his head and said, "We never had a chance." But there was another, quieter victory, one that could not be measured in aircraft totals or output rates. It was the victory of collective purpose. During the war, the United States had achieved something no other democracy had ever done. It had mobilized its free citizens to act as one machine without sacrificing their freedom. Factories were coordinated, resources rationed, priorities assigned, yet all under voluntary cooperation, not tyranny. The government called it war production, but in truth, it was the ultimate expression of democracy in motion. That spirit did not fade when the war ended. It seeded everything that came after, from the interstate highway system to NASA's Apollo missions. The engineers who had once optimized bomber assembly lines now calculated lunar trajectories. The same spirit that turned metal and wool into air power now looked to the stars. In a way, Hermann Göring's laughter had ignited the greatest mobilization in history. His mockery was the spark that drove a nation to prove him wrong. Every rivet, every wing panel, every engine that roared to life was an answer to his arrogance. He believed totalitarian control made nations strong. America proved that free people, when united, could outbuild empires. By the 1950s, the United States was producing more aircraft for peace than it had during the war. Airlines connected continents, cargo planes brought aid to former enemies, airlifts fed the hungry and healed the wounded. The arsenal of democracy had evolved into the aeronautics of humanity. And yet, for all the glory of progress, there were still those who remembered the sound, that endless drone of bombers over the English countryside, the vibration that shook windows as formation after formation took off. Veterans would later say that when they heard the hum of a distant plane in peacetime, it carried both pride and sorrow, because every plane built had a cost, in sweat, in time, in lives. Back in Europe, Göring faced his reckoning. During the Nuremberg trials, he was confronted with evidence of his failures, the arrogance, the blindness, the sheer disbelief that had cost his nation so dearly. When asked about Roosevelt's 50,000 plane promise, Göring smirked for a moment, but there was no laughter left in. "We did not believe it was possible," he said quietly. No one could have. He died before the world could see the jet age truly dawn, before the Cold War turned air power into the defining weapon of a new kind of conflict. But in many ways, the echo of his laughter lingered, not as mockery, but as a reminder that the greatest underestimation in history was not about machines. It was about people. People who built beyond their limits. People who worked without rest, driven not by fear but by conviction. People who turned blueprints into victory. The post-war years proved something the world would never forget. Industrial strength was no longer just about steel or oil, it was about imagination, organization, and belief. In 1940, America had built 6,000 aircraft. By 1945, it had built over 300,000. By 1960, it was launching rockets into orbit. That curve of growth, that relentless climb, was the physical manifestation of human ambition when disbelief turns into drive. And so, when future generations study that era, they often ask, how did it happen? How did one nation, separated by oceans, turn the tide of a global war through production alone? The answer lies not in Roosevelt's speeches, nor in Göring's blunders, but in the small, simple acts, the mechanic tightening a bolt, the riveter hammering at dawn, the engineer erasing and redrawing a line until the math worked. Each act alone was ordinary. Together, they were unstoppable. The laughter that began in Berlin ended in silence, replaced by the roar of engines built by free hands, by citizens who refused to accept limits. And as those planes crossed oceans, carrying not bombs but supplies, not soldiers but aid, they became the wings of a new world, one built not on conquest, but on creation. Because in the end, America didn't just outproduce its enemies, it outdreamed them.